Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about blood vessels and everything included in that discussion. In talking about the vascular system, we're talking mainly about three kinds of vessels. We're talking about arteries, we're talking about veins, and we're talking about capillaries. This vascular system is basically like a system of highways and roads, like an interstate. Would be a big highway. It's a continuous highway. It never stops. Very large roads that when you get off of the exit, you taper down to smaller roads. And then once you get into, from those smaller highways, you go into like subdivisions where you have roads that get smaller and smaller until eventually you run into things like alleyways that are the smallest of all the roads. So the blood system is kind of the same way. We're going to go from large arteries to smaller arteries, which are arterioles, which lead into capillary beds, which eventually will dump blood back into small veins, which lead into larger veins, which eventually lead into the largest veins, which are the superior and the inferior vena cava. So this whole thing kind of started actually in the 17th century, when we really didn't have much of an idea about how circulation occurred in the body. We pretty much thought that blood flowed in the body like a body of water and say like an ocean, and it kind of sloshed around through the tissues. Through the work of William Harvey in the 17th century, who was a physician who was one of the first gentlemen to work on cadavers, work on looking at the internal contents of human beings, and he kind of gave us a whole new perspective on how circulation actually occurred. He gave us a circulatory route, and he basically gave us the idea that blood vessels run in a one-way circuit, okay, contrary to what had been believed before then. One of the things that Harvey also did was he gave us the purpose of the heart. He was the first one to define exactly how the heart worked, and gave us the idea of the heartbeat, told us how the heart worked and what the circulatory routes were in general. He also actually was a kind of a scientist, a biologist who dabbled into other things. One of the major discoveries that he made during the time also was that mammal reproduction was accomplished through fertilization of an egg and sperm. Back then they thought that there was a preformed being and that the sperm cell touching the egg would cause that preformed being to grow into a human being. So that was a kind of a big breakthrough also. Generally, when we look at arteries and veins, we look at the idea that blood carried away from the heart is an artery. Those arteries branch into smaller and smaller arteries until we get to the smallest artery, which is called the arteriole. This usually leads into the smallest of blood vessels, where there's going to be exchanges between the blood and the contents of the blood and the cells in the tissues. And these are called the capillaries, or the capillary beds, as they're called. And this is where the exchanges are going to occur, where waste products are going to be thrown into the blood and nutrients waste products would be taken out of the tissues and into the blood, and from the blood into the tissues would be the nutrients. Blood then basically returns to the heart. Anything that is going toward the heart is going to be a vein. The smallest of the veins are called venules that come out of the capillary beds, and they run into larger and larger veins until they head into the superior and the inferior vena cava, which leads directly into the heart, the right side of the heart. When we look at the different blood vessels, we can see from this diagram that the artery is put together in a much different way than the vein is. The veins are flatter, although there's a larger lumen. A lumen means the space involved. When that vein is filling up with blood, it's going to have a lot larger space in there. The artery, on the other hand, is going to be more rounded. It's going to have more of a thicker wall. You can see the basic difference there. Looking at it microscopically, there are three basic layers that are going to be in these vessels. You have an epithelial layer, which is going to cover the outside. You're going to have a little bit of connective tissue along with the smooth muscle, which is on basically the middle section, and this is going to be controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Whenever the sympathetic nervous system activates the smooth muscle, it'll cause it to contract, and it'll cause constriction of a blood vessel. When those impulses go away, the muscle will relax and it will open up that blood vessel. And then you have basically a layer on the outside, which is mainly fibrous connective tissue. So you have a nice smooth inside. That endothelium is going to be like the inside of the heart. We talked about that earlier, how that had to be nice and smooth, so there's no catching of the blood contents, the red blood cells or the platelets, no building up of that to cause blood clots. Nice and smooth, the endothelium. And then the middle layer is going to be the thick layer, which it's going to have the smooth muscle, and then the outside is going to be a kind of a little bit more of a tougher layer that has fibrous connective tissue holding it together. This diagram kind of shows you the difference of those three layers in terms of thickness. You can see the external epithelium right here is pretty close to being the same between a vein and an artery. The elastic tissue is going to be only in the artery, a little connective tissue in here. The tunica media is going to be the smooth muscle layer. You can see the smooth muscle layer in the artery is going to be much thicker than it is in the vein because of its physiological purposes. Then you have an internal elastic connective tissue, a very small layer right before you get to the endothelium. And you have a little bit of loose connective tissue that's between the endothelium and the elastic layer. The endothelium, like I said, is going to be a nice, smooth, very thin layer that covers and lines the inside. So we have epithelium on the outside, epithelium on the inside, and we have some connective tissue on either side of the smooth muscle layers. But as you can see, there's a very small layers of each of those in the vein as opposed to the artery. The artery is going to be carrying blood under high pressure. The veins are going to be carrying blood under very low pressure. So that's basically the difference in the makeup. The anatomy of each of them is going to be directly related to what they do. This one takes high-pressured blood from the heart and delivers it to the tissues, and this one over here, the vein, is going to be just simply trying to return that to the heart under low pressure. So the obvious anatomical differences are going to be related to what they do physiologically. So what are the main differences between the blood vessels? The walls of the arteries are thicker. The cardiac layer, the smooth muscle layer is going to be much thicker. The lumen of the veins is going to be larger. The space inside of that vessel is going to be larger. The larger veins are going to also have one-way valves that are kind of like the valves that are in the heart. They're going to make sure that blood does not backflow, and you only find these in the larger veins. When we exercise and move around, basically the muscles contracting has a milking sort of fashion that helps to keep the blood moving toward the heart. That's why people who stand when they work, it's always advised to them to move their feet around and pick their legs up and move around a little bit as they're working to try to maintain blood flow and not just stand in one still position. You'll be able to see that the walls of the capillaries are going to be, capillaries being the smallest vessels, these are only going to be one epithelial cell layer thickness to allow for exchanges to occur between the blood and the cells of the body. We always talked about the capillaries as being leaky. They're leaky for a reason. Fluids carrying ingredients can flow easily between the outside of the tissues and the inside of the capillaries. Also, this one cell layer and leakiness of the capillaries allows for specialized cells like macrophages to creep in and out of the blood system and get into the tissues and attack and destroy foreign invaders. So the capillaries are the way they are for a very good reason. Once again, anatomy is directly related to the physiology. Once again, you can see the difference, the thick wall of the artery here and the very thin wall of the vein, the smaller space of the artery and the larger space of the vein. This diagram kind of shows you the milking action that occurs whenever muscles are being used. It helps to return the flow of blood to the heart. Obviously, if we're trying to increase the heart rate and deliver blood at a very high rate during exercise, we have to be able to return that blood to the heart. And in the using of the muscles, we're actually providing that increased venous return to the heart. Also, you can see right here, you have in the larger veins, you have the backflow valves that are located here. They'll slap shut. As muscles contract and push blood this way, they'll also push blood this way, and this will keep the blood from backflowing. I might say also one of the differences generally between arteries and veins is generally depicted as arteries carry red, rich, oxygenated blood, and veins carry, in diagrams, they're depicted as blue blood. Actually, blood is not blue. It's more of a more maroonish, purplish, darker red color. But that would be the deoxygenated blood. There are exceptions to that rule. The exceptions are that when we pump blood out of the heart to the lungs in the pulmonary circulation, we're going to be pumping blood, deoxygenated blood, into the pulmonary pulmonary arteries. So the pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blue blood to the lungs, and then they're going to carry oxygenated rich red blood back to the left side of the heart by way of the pulmonary veins. So there's the exception to that rule. Also, in our portal systems, which I'll talk about later, we're going to have an exception that's the same as that also. So, generally speaking, arteries carry oxygenated blood, veins carry deoxygenated blood, except for those exceptions. Most of the arterial blood is going to be pumped out of the heart by the heart, and the veins are generally going to be returning blood to the heart with the help of milking action of the skeletal muscle. ESPN. The capillary beds are going to basically consist of two types of vessels. You're going to have something called a vascular shunt, which is basically an on-off valve. This vessel directly connects an arteriole to a venule, the smallest of the arteries to the smallest of a vein. And basically, when the shunt is completely on, it would completely cut blood off from going into a capillary bed, and would basically take it from the arteriole right straight to the venule, or some degree of reduced blood flow because of the shunt. The true capillaries is where all the exchange occurs between the tissues and the blood. Oxygen and the nutrients are obviously going to cross the capillary walls and get into the cells, and the carbon dioxide and other metabolic wastes are going to cross the capillary wall and go into the blood and be taken to the lungs to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and to the kidneys to be filtering out the metabolic wastes. This is a good picture of the differences between the different components of a capillary bed. You can see over here you have the smallest of the arteries, which is an arteriole. The arteriole would then branch into an area of where we're going to serve a certain amount of tissue. We look at how small these vessels are here. When you combine all the arteries and veins and all the capillaries in an average human being, you're going to look at something like 100,000 miles of blood vessels. That's a lot of intricate little blood flow to get blood to supply all the tissues with their needed nutrients. One of the things that happen whenever a person starts gaining fat, an extra little tidbit here, for every pound of fat that you put onto your body, you generally have to put out an extra mile of blood vessels to supply that. So one of the reasons why people are always told to keep their weight down is because you do have to supply that extra tissue in the body. You have to supply it with blood. And so if you're for every pound of fat you're putting an extra mile of blood vessels in there, that's going to put a lot of extra work on the heart. That's why being obese is very, very hard on the heart. So basically, two things can happen here, and this is kind of all or nothing, and it doesn't always happen like this. The shunt, which is basically a sphincter, can either open or close. When it's closed, it's going to close off the capillary bed, and it's going to force blood to go directly from the arteriole into the venule. Okay. Now, for the most part, this doesn't happen completely all that often. One of the reasons why it would happen and these are always temporary also. These are always ongoing, spur-of-the-moment decisions the body makes. Sometimes to reduce the blood pressure on a temporary basis, the shunts will be used and there'll be almost a complete closure. Very seldom does that happen. One of the reasons why we would shunt the blood from the arteriole to the venule, leaving only a little bit of blood to flow through the capillary bed and supply tissues, would be like in the instance of thermal regulation of the body. Say, for instance, and this was an area of the skin in cold weather. Well, we'd want to have as little about a blood flow going to the skin as possible, because the blood carries lots of heat, and the more blood that would go to the skin, the more heat that would be lost to the environment. So during cold weather, we would shunt a lot of the blood flow that's going into the capillary bed to where it would be on a minimal basis to supply tissues with nutrients. In hot weather, then we would completely open up the sphincters and allow as much blood to get into the capillary beds as possible. And that's why in hot weather your skin would be a reddish color, and in cold weather it would be a more pale color because you have less blood going because of the vascular shunts that are involved in the blood flow in the capillary beds. What we're going to be doing is we're going to skip the major arteries of the circulatory system. In other words, the gross anatomy of the circulatory system. We're not going to go into all the blood vessels. The ones I want you to know, I've pretty much already told you about the major ones that are going to and leaving the heart. We will go into a little bit of a discussion on what a portal system is, and then we're basically just going to move on to the end of the chapter where we'll be talking about some of the aspects of the physiology of the circulatory system, like talk about pulse and blood pressure and some of the things that go along with that. So we have probably one more lecture to get us through to the end, and that will probably be a little bit longer than this one, but that'll finish up the chapter. We're not going to go into specifically naming all the vessels. We're going to try to move on to the next chapter and get as much done as we can this year. So that is that's the vascular system, and we'll talk to you later. Adios, amigos.